Thank you all for joining Darien Library this evening for Musical Theater is Allegory, The Road to Hadestown with Gil Harel. Gil, as many of you already know, is a musicologist and music theorist whose interests include styles ranging from Western classical repertoire to jazz. Previously, he served on the faculty at Baruch College, where he was awarded the prestigious Presidential Excellence Award for Distinguished Teaching. Currently, Gil's teaching at Naugatuck Valley Community College, where he was presented with the Merit Award for exemplary service to the college. At Naugatuck, Gil conducts the college chorale, the a cappella ensemble. He teaches music history and theory and serves as musical director of all the theater productions. Outside of teaching, Gil still enjoys staying active as a pianist and a vocalist. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by the annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your support to make programs like this, as well as our collections available to the community. I hope everyone is ready to learn about Hadestown, and I'm now going to pass the mic to Gil.
Thank you so much, Pat, and thank you to the Darien Library for continuing to host these great programs, even though, of course, as one student reminded me today, we are now in something like day 325 since things spiraled downwards very quickly last March. Actually, if you were to go back to last March and go visit Broadway, I think you'd have a hard time finding a hotter show than Hadestown. Before the shutdown, this was the must-see show, and at the 73rd Tony Awards back in June of 2019, when those took place, Hadestown did exceptionally well. In fact, it was nominated for 12 awards and won 8, including Best Musical and Best Original Score. Well, I think when we have a show such as this one that attracts so much attention and garners so many accolades, one of the questions that we want to ask ourselves is, what's so special about it? Why has this show been so compelling, so enchanting, and so beloved in its short run? And it really did have a short run. It was just about a year on Broadway before it was forced to shut down. And I think, like so many of you in the audience tonight, many of us are looking forward not only to the reopening of the theaters, which is currently projected for next fall, but specifically to the reopening of Hadestown, because, as I said, before the shutdown, which is now some 325 days in the rearview mirror, you would be hard-pressed to find a hotter ticket than a ticket to go see Hadestown. So we're going to ask ourselves this evening, what is it about the show that makes it so great, so compelling? And can we hear these things on a first hearing? Is this something that we can appreciate through a terse and introductory exposure to the score? And I think the answer, of course, is yes. Now, it's also worth pointing out that this particular show has a couple of unique and disparate musical influences. Of course, there's traditional musical theater, that goes without saying, but there's also elements of other genres, and some of those genres are rather disconnected. And one might think that this hodgepodge of musical potpourri might make for a disconnected show, but actually one of the brilliant strokes of genius in the score is how these disparate musical styles come together to form a composite amalgam, which is very satisfying, I think, to the average listener. So some of those elements we're going to hear tonight would include, of course, traditional musical theater, which I mentioned, but also folk music and folk rock specifically. Anaïs Mitchell, the composer, is essentially a folk musician, I think is how she would describe herself. We're also going to hear, strangely enough, some jazz, and it's jazz that takes us back not to the 1960s or 1950s, or even to the 40s and the bebop era, the 30s and the swing era. There are elements of jazz here that are going to go all the way back to what's sometimes called trad jazz or traditional jazz, that is to say, jazz that's associated with the city of New Orleans and has been, and that goes back to the 1920s and well beyond that, of course. And this is sort of topical because today is, well, Mardi Gras, Fat Tuesday, and therefore some connection to Mardi Gras, between Mardi Gras and the city of New Orleans, or as the locals there call it, Nolans, as I understand it, is worth pointing out. So we're talking about Hadestown. And if you're not familiar with this show, I'll describe the plot in broad strokes, and we'll go through, and I've prepared 4 or 5 excerpts for us to listen to, which will give us a sense of how this musical works on a structural level. We'll also look at some of the musical highlights and talk about some of those Velcro songs, if you will, some of those tunes that you hear. And of course, we call them Velcro tunes because once you hear it, well, you'll be humming it, singing it, or tapping your foot to it for at least the next day or so. And I'm sure everyone on the call has experienced the phenomenon of the Velcro song, or as the Germans call it, ein Ohrwurm, literally an earworm, as in something that burrows into your tympanum and remains lodged there for a certain fixed period of time. The story of Hadestown is loosely based on the myth of Orpheus. Now, I know there are a number of you in the audience tonight who are Greek mythology buffs, so you'll no doubt be familiar with the story of Orpheus. For those who aren't, I will go through the original plot first because it's going to be very important that we understand the original plot in order to understand what I'm describing in the title of this program as musical allegory in Hadestown. In other words, Hadestown is going to present a version of the Orpheus myth, but it's not going to be the original. In fact, it's going to be tweaked and warped in several significant ways. And understanding how it's tweaked and how it's warped and changed and reconfigured and recombobulated is going to be very important for understanding the thrust of this show. That is to say, I think it's fair to point out that Anaïs Mitchell and Rachel Chavitz and the others who were involved in bringing this to Broadway, they were not interested in simply recreating the story of Orpheus and Eurydice in the underworld. That's been done before. And of course, in theater, one of the important elements that all theater creators strive for, to some degree, I think, is originality and novelty sometimes even. So this is a reinvention of the Orpheus myth. And if you don't read it carefully, there are some things that can fly under the radar. And if you miss them, then I would suggest that one is missing a significant part of what makes this show, or what gives it its identity, essentially. So let's go through the original Orpheus myth first, and then we'll talk about the genesis and ontology of how this work came to be, and then we'll look at specific excerpts from the musical. The myth of Orpheus takes us back to the fields of Thrace, I guess, in ancient Greece. And we're presented with Orpheus. He's obviously one of our main characters in the musical, and in the Orpheus myth, he is the main character. He's presented to us as a demigod. That is to say, he's half mortal and half god. And his god side, that is to say, the divine aspect of his being, or I should say probably supernatural is a better way to render that, not divine, but supernatural, is that he is the son of Zeus. And as such, he's imbued with very special powers. Demigods, remember, have aspects of the that which typifies the gods in the pantheon of Greek mythology. That is to say, they all tend to have a kind of what we might think of today as a superpower. And what is Orpheus's superpower? Well, he has the power of music. That is to say, he's such a good musician that in the original myth, his skills are described as so formidable, so prodigious, that he has the power to compel the attention and the love and the emotions, such as they are, of the beasts of the fields, and even the trees themselves bend towards him as he plays. So powerful is Orpheus's ability as a musician. And in the literature, in paintings and other drawings and evocations of this story, the character of Orpheus is almost inexorably presented to us holding a lyre, which looks sort of like a harp, I guess would be the closest, but it's much smaller. Now, in the history of theater, the story of Orpheus has been presented many times. And let me just give you 2 examples of that. One of the earliest operas in the Western canon takes us back to the first decade of the 17th century, if you can believe it. Most musicologists agree that opera was created right around the year 1600 at the dawn of the Baroque period. And early in the Baroque period, an Italian composer by the name of Claudio Monteverdi is going to create an opera based on the Orpheus myth. It's simply called L'Orfeo, una favola per musica. Orpheus, a myth in music, that is to say, the myth told in music. And, that's a very traditional telling of the story. Music is by Claudio Monteverdi and the libretto by Alessandro Striggio. And that again dates from 1607-08. So the idea of the story of Orpheus being told on a stage goes back more than 400 years from the time that Hadestown will make its way to Broadway. Other examples from the time of Mozart. Now, Mozart never wrote an opera based on the story, but one of his contemporaries did. His name was Christoph Willibald Gluck, and you might know that version either in Italian or perhaps even in French. Actually, it's one of those operas that has had its libretto translated and performed in 2 different languages. So Gluck has a setting of Orpheus. Probably the most famous excerpt from that opera from the 1770s would be Che farò senza Eurydice? What would I do without, or what shall I do without Eurydice? Is a question that Orpheus asks himself at the end of the opera. This is, well, perhaps telegraphing the ending, but as I said, I think many of you are likely familiar with this myth. But nonetheless, for those who aren't, or for those who require a refresher, it would be helpful for us to go through it before we get to Hadestown, because after all, we really want to be able to compare the Hadestown version of the story to the original story. So Orpheus is presented to us in the opening of the story, and he is a demigod. He is imbued with this uncanny ability as a musician to tame and charm and enchant anybody who listens to him. And that includes not just fellow humans or even gods, as we'll see, but also things that we think of as inanimate, including the trees and the flowers and such. And this is his power as a musician. If you think about it, what we're dealing with here, at least when this story is set as an opera, or in this case as a musical, is a story told in music about, well, the power of music. So there are layers to peel back here. In this particular case, it's a love story. And Orpheus sings early on in the story, and he tells us, I used to be sad. I was down in the doldrums, so to speak, but now I am on cloud 9. I am euphoric. I am steeped in the greatest glow of joy and just ebullience. And the reason is I have found love. And that love, of course, is with Eurydice, or in the original, if you know the Italian version, by Monteverdi in the opera Eurydice. So he loves Eurydice, and yet he gets some bad news. Eurydice has been bitten by a snake and she's died. So he resolves, you know what, I'm not going to take this lying down. I'm going to go down to where the departed souls are taken by the psychopomps in Greek mythology. They're ferried across the river Styx by Charon, who keeps that boundary, and they reside in Hades, in this underworld. And of course, one of the prerequisites to go to Hades is one has to be deceased. No mortal living soul may enter. And so when Orpheus goes down to Hades to try to rescue or retrieve Eurydice, he is greeted by Charon, the ferryman, who says, sorry, buddy, but you're clearly alive, and as you're not dead, then you cannot enter. You cannot cross this river Styx, and you cannot enter Hades. Well, this might work, and this might have deterred the average adventurer, but remember that Orpheus has an ace in the hole. And so he produces his lyre and begins to sing, and Charon, who is the stern and intransigent ferryman, is so charmed and so enchanted by his singing that he allows the rules to be broken, and Orpheus is allowed to make his way into Hades, where he can attempt to bargain with the Lord of the Underworld, and that is Pluto, or, well, as he's known in the musical, simply Hades. Hades lives in Hades. So the god of the underworld, who's married, by the way, to Persephone, is residing in this dark kingdom. And when he meets Orpheus, Orpheus attempts to make his case that his beloved should be sent back to the surface as to dwell with him in the fields of Thrace. And, well, remember I said that Charon was intransigent? Well, compared to him, Pluto, or Hades, is downright rigid, and he is not inclined to grant this request. However, he's willing to make a compromise. And so he says to Orpheus, I tell you what, you've come all this way, and I applaud you. I give you a lot of credit for coming here. So here's what we're going to do. You can have an opportunity to return to the surface with your beloved, and you must lead, but you have to travel there without looking back a single time. If you so much as glance over your shoulder to verify that Eurydice is in fact right behind you, she'll be lost to you forever. And as the myth continues, Orpheus agrees. He ascends to the surface world, and just before he gets to the top, his anxiety and paranoia gets the best of him. He turns around and sees that Eurydice was right behind him all the time, but now she is lost to him. Now, as the myth continues, there are different versions of how the story ends. In the original version, when Orpheus turns to the surface world, he's alone and despondent, and he is promptly, savagely murdered by followers of Bacchus, that is Dionysus, the god of drink and drunken reveling and that sort of thing. I don't think I need to tell anyone in the audience that that particular ending would not make for a very compelling operatic ending, nor would it work in a musical. And so in Monteverdi's version, for example, in 1607, Apollo, as he's described, as he's called in the libretto, arrives and he says, don't worry, my son, your beloved awaits you up in the firmament, and she's been transformed into a star. Well, that's not a happy ending, but it's not a tragic ending either. Are we going to get something similar in Hadestown? Stay tuned and you'll find out in about 45 minutes. Now, I encourage you, if you have any questions, to go ahead and put them in the Q&A, and I will address them in real time, and certainly we'll have some time at the end of the program. What's different when we compare Hadestown to, say, a traditional telling of the Orpheus myth? Well, first of all, the setting is completely different. I think one of the reasons that the composer, Anaïs Mitchell, chose to weave in this jazzy introduction, which features André de Shields in the role of Hermes as the narrator, I think is that by using this style, which takes us back 100 years, it takes us back to a time which, when presented simultaneously with the visual aspect of this show staging, really makes one think of the Great Depression. And that really is how I would describe it, and I think that's how it's usually described in the literature, and certainly in a playbill or program, that's how it would be described. It's a setting that is meant to evoke the Great Depression era. That is to say, it's sort of sooty and grimy, and people are sort of laboring very, very under very difficult conditions, trying to keep themselves fed. Starvation is a theme that comes up in the musical, and it influences some of the important decisions which are made by the characters. I mentioned Hermes. He's an important figure here, and actually it's kind of easy to conjure up the other characters because there are not many. This is a relatively small cast. So we have Hermes, sung here by André de Shields, and one can't help but smile when you hear Mr. de Shields sing. He's just so effective. I don't think anyone would say he has the prettiest voice, so to speak, but he has a commanding presence. And even though we won't get to watch much of the production in terms of seeing it fully staged, obviously seeing a fully staged Broadway production, even if you could find a bootleg on YouTube, and these things do exist, the quality is not very good. But we will get to watch a production of a song from the end of Act One called Wait For Me, which was performed at the Tony Awards just about a year and a half ago. So we will get to see a little bit of how this is staged. But for most of our listening tonight, we will be listening to the Broadway cast recording and looking at the score. As those of you who are veterans of the programs know, I am a great advocate for score reading, even for those who profess not to read a lick of music, not a scintilla of sheet music. You'll be surprised at how much you're able to absorb and follow looking at this score. So we open up and we get this New Orleans influenced jazz number. It's very upbeat. It's got a brassy sort of sound, which is driven by trombone in the early measures. And it gives the piece a kind of raucous quality. And again, when I say raucous, imagine New Orleans. One of the strangest things for outsiders who visit New Orleans is when you see some of the old, when you read about or watch videos or witness some of the old burial customs, and you would see these funeral parades, which would be led by brass bands playing up-tempo music, which we think of funeral music. It has to be slow and in a minor key. In other words, it should be a dirge. And that's certainly not what we get here. I'm not suggesting that the musical is meant to suggest a funeral or anything like that, but it does have this festive and boisterous stentorian quality to it. And I think it fits really well, not only with the time period that it's meant to evoke, but also with the themes which are being discussed. We talked about them earlier, the idea that people are starving and people are working very hard. And Hadestown is not a place for the faint of heart. It's a really tough place to live. So that's a little about that. Who are some of the other characters that we're going to meet? Well, I've mentioned Orpheus. I've mentioned Eurydice. We talked about Hades, obviously, and we even mentioned Persephone a little bit. In addition to this, we're going to get the three fates. The fates are interesting. It's a female trio that sings almost in the style of what you might think of as the different inclinations that exist within a person's psyche. That is to say, the fates tend to sing at moments when a character is faced with a decision, and the fates kind of represent that character's decision to pursue a certain path. Now, you could say, are the fates the ones singing to the character and the character is listening to the fates? I don't think it really matters how you interpret it, as long as we agree that the fates, their job is mostly to direct, well, go ahead and figure, the fate or the path, the trajectory of the various characters, specifically Orpheus and Eurydice. So that's sort of the cast list for this. Those are the important figures. There are some important dichotomies in how these singers and actors are cast. For example, Reeve Carney, who plays Orpheus in the Broadway production, is a kind of a counter-tenor voice. He sings way up in the tippity top of the tenor range and really sometimes all the way into the alto and occasionally even into the soprano register, into the middle of the fifth octave at times. So, the character of Orpheus, who, remember, his character represents sort of the power of music, has this very high voice. And that's done deliberately, right? Think about how in music, listeners have always esteemed and prized the high notes. Even today, in various genres, high notes tend to get a lot of the glory, if you will, whereas low notes tend not to be as esteemed. Speaking of low notes, Orpheus's voice is contrasted with Hades' voice. Orpheus lives on the surface world. Eventually, he's going to go to Hades to try to rescue his love, but it's this sort of evocation of the stratification of where these characters exist. And Hades, because he lives in Hadestown, which is described as way down under the ground, it's not just a bass. He's not just a low bass. He's not just a very low bass, or what we call a basso profundo. This is a special kind of voice. Let me suggest that this is a voice that would be very difficult to find. If you were to try to do the show in community theater, and even if you were casting it in a big way with hundreds of people auditioning, you might not get a single bass who could hit the notes that are written for the character of Hades. For those of you who are note watchers, Hades has to sing all the way down to a G in the first octave. G1 is the note. It's sort of defies the expectation of anybody who's looking at the score. You might think that can't be right. But on this recording, we will hear Patrick Page sing that note at the end of the song, How Long, in Act 2. So that is on the docket for us this evening, and we'll get to it. Other things that are interesting about this setting. Well, Hades is not just the underworld where the deceased go. It's very different here. It really, there's nothing to do, it has nothing to do with the dead or the domain of the dead. Instead, Hadestown is described as this sort of really rough and tumble industrial area that exists underground, and it's a kind of factory town. So you could think of the Industrial Revolution here, you could think of Victorian England. That's, I think, baked into this pie as well. And it's dark and it's sooty and it's grimy and it's not at all a comfortable place in many ways. However, it does confer some advantages on those who dwell there. Number one, they have full bellies. Hadestown takes care of those who live in Hadestown. It's also warm. And that's important because one of the themes that's introduced in Hadestown is that the surface world alternates between essentially two seasons. The spring and the summer, which are beautiful and just comfortable and filled with abundance and plenty, and people have full bellies and are prospering. And then the fall and winter, when things are not so sunny, and people are starving and facing real challenges, and there's gloominess and dolorous depression and the like. Now, the reason, as we find out in the musical, for this dichotomy between the seasons has everything to do with Hades' wife, and that's, of course, Persephone. When Persephone marries Hades, there's an agreement that she will spend half of the year on the surface and half of the year in Hadestown. And because she is the goddess of sun and warmth and the like, when she comes to the surface for that half of the year that she's contractually allowed to spend on the surface, it's a beautiful place to live and to work and to dwell. But for the 6 months of the year where she's forced to live in Hadestown with her husband, who's a bit of a tyrant, by the way, not a bit of, he really is an authoritarian tyrant, then surface conditions become really, really rough. So this dichotomy in how the world is presented is all tied up with the character of Persephone. Actually, there's a lot to say about how Persephone's character is written and presented here. We'll move on. We'll encounter her a little bit later in the evening's program. So we're going to open with the first number, which is called The Road to Hell. Now, it's sung primarily by Hades, but you'll hear the whole ensemble. We've perhaps talked about this in the past. In musicals, it's very typical to open up with a big ensemble number. That's not always the case in an opera. In fact, many times it's not the case at all in an opera. But opening with the ensemble in a musical is really standard fare, certainly in modern musical theater history. So here, I'm going to go ahead and share the score with you, and we'll take a look at the Hadestown score. And you can see here that there's a certain amount of ad-libbing done. Do you see these slash marks? Well, we see this all the time in jazz, and we see it occasionally in musical theater as well. What that means is that the person playing is expected to improvise something that's based on whatever chord symbol is provided. So here we're based in B flat, and I wouldn't exactly call this a B flat dominant chord because it's more about what we call a pentatonic scale. So you'll hear sometimes the chorus is singing what sounds like major, sometimes the trombone plays what sounds like a minor, third. In other words, for those of you who are not music theorists, which is just about everyone on the call, although I am delighted to see that there are some music theorists on the call, what you're going to hear in this opening number is that it sort of floats between major and minor. And again, the technical term for this style of this opener is it's pentatonic, really. So let's go ahead and listen to this opening number. It's narrated by Hermes. Hermes is described as the god of roads and tolls and paths, and he's one who sort of, he doesn't have a horse in the race. The character of Hermes is sort of neutral. He's a neutral narrator. However, it's clear, certainly by halfway through the musical, by the end of Act 1, it's very clear that Hermes has taken a liking to Orpheus and is going to try to help him if he can. So here's Road to Hell. This is the first song, and it's, you know, for any composer, when you're writing that first song, you wanted to grab the audience's attention and also to effectively introduce the drama and the cast of characters. And this song checks all the boxes, right? You've got that incredibly fun and engaging trombone part, which is weaving and wending its way through this B flat, as I use that word, I'll come back to it, this pentatonic realm, which is neither really major nor minor, though probably in this case closer to major. And we meet all the characters, and they're kind of introduced by Hermes, who's breaking the fourth wall, right? He's addressing the audience. He even introduces the pit, and I love that moment about halfway through the recording where he introduces the pit, and the trombonist just starts playing this really impressive lick, which is very typical, right? When you're in a band and let's see, the singer or whoever it is, the MC is introducing you, as each instrumentalist is being introduced, they tend to play something that's a little bit busy, a little bit more complex, that is to say, to show off a little bit. And we get exactly that. The fates here are described simply as three women who wore the same thing, and the idea that they kind of are the ones that are helping characters make decisions is introduced. Orpheus is described as a sad boy who's writing a song. That's really important. That's a detail that's central to the plot of Hadestown, which is not in the original story. And Eurydice is described as a poor girl who's hungry and looking for something to eat. And obviously that aspect is not in the original story. So how might we compare the original version to what we just saw? Well, let's talk about the differences in the musical. Hadestown, as we said, is not the underworld where the psychopomps ferry the souls of the dead. Instead, Hadestown is a kind of dark and very rough and rigid industrial town, factory-driven, with sort of filled with laborers who, yes, they work long hours, and yes, they're covered in dirt and grime, and maybe they never see the sun, but at least they go to sleep with a full belly, and at least there's safety and security because Hadestown is run with an iron fist by Hades himself. We learn that Persephone here is the bringer of seasons, essentially, in this story, and her presence is synonymous with prosperity and good weather and comfort and the like, and her absence is going to spell misery for many. And this is a cycle that perpetually renews itself every year. Obviously, you know, the story, even though it's called Hadestown, this is really the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. So let's take a look at an early number in the show. This one's called Epic 1, and there's a number of songs. Actually, there's 3 of them in the show that have the title Epic. We'll listen to 2 of them this evening. Now, they're presented to us in the style of what we might call a recitative. That is to say, there's no steady rhythm for much of it. It's chords which are introduced over which Orpheus is going to sing. And in that way, it sort of evokes the early operas of the 17th century. The recitative is something that goes back to the Baroque period, and it was around for a very long time, really until the Romantic period. It isn't until Wagner, essentially, that recitative is done away with by operatic composers. So it's kind of interesting for it to be a part of the musical texture here, and the musical presentation. You'll see what it sounds like momentarily, or hear what it sounds like. Essentially, imagine a musical style that doesn't have a strong pulse and doesn't have a sense of concrete time signature and the like, but rather it has a free sort of floating quality. Now, in this number, I'll catch you up. Early in the musical, Orpheus asks Eurydice to marry him. Well, that's part of the original myth. We know that Eurydice was going to be married to Orpheus before she met with that untimely snakebite, which spelled her demise. In this version, as we know, she doesn't die, but we also know that she's profoundly uncomfortable, especially with hunger. And she loves Orpheus, and her love for him only deepens during the course of the musical. But initially, she doesn't want to say yes immediately, because she's not convinced that Orpheus can provide for her. He's a poor musician, if you will, a starving artist, if we want to use that term. And the idea that she has this trepidation, this fear, that if she marries Orpheus, the 2 of them will just starve together, and that will sort of be the one of the clouds that looms over their marriage. Well, she's going to be convinced eventually by Orpheus, obviously. And what he's going to tell her is central to the plot of the musical, but it's not in the original. What he's saying is, I'm working on a song, and when I finish this song, it's going to be the perfect song. And when I finish this perfect song, it's going to restore the world to a balanced state. That is to say, we won't have to deal with this dichotomy of radically different seasons, if you will, of periods of privation and starvation versus periods of prosperity. Everything is going to be sort of made right, if you will, by this one perfect song I'm writing. And Eurydice is convinced by Orpheus. And as he's singing this song, actually, we heard a little snippet of it from Orpheus when he sings ever so briefly, just a couple of measures that he sings in the opening number. We're going to hear this melody sung over and over again. And it's a tune that is associated with some very specific imagery, which I'll talk about. But it's a very clever stroke on the part of the composer, Anaïs Mitchell here. This whole musical started as a concept album, that is to say, a series of interrelated songs that would be presented simply orally as a sonic phenomenon and not as a visual phenomenon, not with acting and costumes and choreography and the like. And there are other musicals, by the way. This is not the first musical to start with a concept album. Those of you who, for example, just to give you one example, Jesus Christ Superstar began as a concept album in 1970. And then within a couple of years became one of the most important musicals, arguably, of the 1970s. So Hadestown begins as a concept album, but morphs into this celebrated musical. And as we know, there are some differences here. Here's one of the real strokes of wisdom, I think, that comes through in the score is the use of what might be called leitmotif. The idea of using a recurring cell of a melody or a fragment of notes that immediately conjures up a very specific image for the audience. The term leitmotif, as many of you know, is associated originally with Richard Wagner and his operas, such as Tristan and Isolde and the Ring Cycle. But I think you can use that term validly here because what Orpheus is going to sing very early in the musical, we first hear it in the opening number, but we're going to hear it fleshed out in Epic 1, is essentially a tune that comes back over and over again and is associated with this perfect song he's trying to write. And again, that melody is going to figure very prominently here. And because we hear it so many times, every time we hear it, we're reminded that this is what Orpheus is working on for the whole duration of the show, practically. He's trying to write that one tune to restore the world to balance. So here's the score for Epic 1. So there's the tune that's going to be associated with Orpheus's quest to write the perfect song. But as we know, it's a tune that has this rich history, and it's sung to the story of Hades and Persephone and this love that they had, which burns so bright. But as we're going to find out in Act 1, has since diminished considerably. Hades, we get the sense, is a truculent and difficult man to be married to. And as I said, he rules Hadestown with an iron fist. Hadestown is this isolated place where who goes in and who goes out is carefully monitored. And the only way to get into Hadestown, as we heard in the very first number, is you got to get on the train. Chugga, chugga, chugga. Remember, they were imitating the sounds of the train. So the only way to get to Hadestown is through the train, or at least that's what we're led to believe. That's going to be important when we get to the next number, because we're going to skip all the way to the end of Act 1. So what happens in Act 1 that brings us here? Well, as I said, we learn about Hades and Persephone and the love, this flame between them, which has flickered and diminished considerably. Persephone goes up to the surface for that half of the year where the sun is shining twice as bright, as the song says. And as we actually meet her early in Act 1, and when she has to return and get on the train to go back to Hadestown, and she's miserable. She wants to stay. She does not want to return to her husband. Meanwhile, Orpheus is sort of in his own determined way working on this song, and it makes him less attentive to things which are perhaps more superficially important. And that would include, for example, food. So Eurydice, at one particularly desperate moment in Act 1, about halfway through Act 1, is walking around sort of scavenging, looking for something to eat. And who should she run into but Hades himself? Hades has come up to the surface world to look for likely candidates to invite to work in Hadestown. And Eurydice is so desperate, so hungry, so cold, and so miserable. She's been subjected to such privation that she is convinced by Hades to get on the train and go to Hadestown. In fact, the fates play an important role in that scene, but nonetheless. So where is Orpheus? Well, he's nowhere to be found at this time because he's working on his song. This is where we hear the song Epic 2, which we won't listen to tonight, but nonetheless, he's working on the song. He hasn't finished it yet. And meanwhile, as he's working on the song, his beloved has now gone to Hadestown. Unbeknownst to Eurydice and to Orpheus, for that matter, is the fact that once you go to Hadestown, you kind of sign your soul over to Hades. So Hades here is presented as a kind of a devil-type figure. You literally sell your soul to him. You trade your industry and your essence to him in order to be under his wardship and to experience the advantages conferred upon those who dwell in Hadestown, namely that you don't starve to death and that you don't freeze to death. So that's the plus side of being in Hadestown. Other than that, it's a really miserable place to be. Now we are going to look at a scene from Act 1, and I mentioned that this is a production featuring the Broadway cast at the Tony Awards, so we'll actually get to see them. The song is called Wait For Me, and it was done live at the Tonys in June of 2019, so you'll get to see what this looks like. You'll see the character of Hades, who's dressed in a kind of a, you know, he wears different things throughout the show, but they tend to be very businesslike on the one hand, but also sometimes very colorful, and they sort of project the sense of authority. We'll meet Hermes. Hermes is the first one to sing, and when Orpheus is shown, he's usually got a guitar strapped to him. We'll also see the folks who dwell in Hadestown, and they're presented here again sort of with makeup that makes them look very dirty. They're wearing mining helmets, so they look like they're, you know, working this back-breaking labor. And we find out, by the way, in Act 1 that Hades, in order to reinforce the defenses of Hadestown, is building a wall around Hadestown. So really the only way in is via the train. The problem is the train only comes and goes at certain times. And because he's missed that window, Orpheus cannot get to Hades. Hadestown, that is, but he wants to get there desperately, so he appeals to Hermes, and Hermes is going to tell him how to get there. And so this song, which happens at the end of Act 1, is all about Orpheus in this quest to get to Hadestown. So there is a parallel here with the original story, remember? In the original story, Eurydice is bitten by a snake and she dies, and she goes to Hades. And in order to get there, Orpheus has to do something which he's supposedly not allowed to do. He has to cross the river Styx, and he charms Charon, the ferryman, in order to get into Hades. Here, Orpheus isn't bitten by a snake, nor does she die, but she is sort of trapped in Hades. She signs her soul over in order to avoid starvation and freezing. She decides that she should go to Hadestown to work. Orpheus discovers this, that his beloved is lost to him, and so he makes this promise to himself to pursue her, even though really, again, he can't get there via train, which we're led to believe is the only way in. But Hermes, remember we said, is the god of pathways, if you might think of it that way. And so he's going to give Orpheus a map, so to speak. And he says, you can get there, but let me tell you, it is not easy if you're trying to get to Hadestown without the train. And he gives him a very detailed description. And then the chorus comes in and Orpheus sings, "Wait for me, my love, I'm coming." Here is the end of Act 1. The song is called "Wait for Me." And again, like I said, it's very hard to find productions of this musical where you can watch the original Broadway cast with professionally recorded audio and video. But where you will be likely to encounter these kinds of videos is at, for example, something like the Tony Awards, or maybe on the Today Show, or the Thanksgiving Day Parade. For musical theater, those are going to be your go-to sources if you're looking for clips to watch music. The presentation here is very effective. I find that with those lights swinging back and forth, it almost conjures up the old game Frogger, for those of you who remember This idea of having to traverse a very perilous path with many obstacles in the way. And of course, that is what faces Orpheus. Notice that the river Styx here is described, I don't know if anybody caught this, but Hermes describes it as a wall of cinder blocks and razor wire. So instead of there being a river that's filled with obviously water, here Styx is described, the boundary between Hadestown and the outer world is described as this sort of menacing wall that evokes the Berlin Wall, or whatever example we want to use, something that's sort of dangerous and formidable looking, rather than simply the river Styx as it's presented in the original story. Nonetheless, the bones of the story, with some wrinkles, are more or less preserved. This is definitely the Orpheus myth, but here adapted to a new setting, which we'll talk about within the next 15 minutes when we wrap up. We've got 2 more numbers to get to, so let's talk about Act 2. Orpheus does successfully make his way down to Hadestown, and he in fact gets an audience with none other than Hades himself. Hades is presented as cold, completely emotionally bereft. That is to say, he comes across as somebody who couldn't care less about the plight of those who dwell in Hadestown, which now includes Eurydice. And when Orpheus arrives, he attempts to sway the lord of Hadestown into allowing his beloved to return to the surface with him. And Hades, being the rigid and intransigent tyrannical ruler that he is, denies this request, laughing in poor Orpheus's face. And this leaves Hades to retire to the next scene with his wife Persephone. And Persephone has been moved deeply by the plea that Orpheus has made. And so she pleads with her husband. She says to him, Hades, the boy means nothing to you. The girl means nothing to you. Let them go. Can't you see that this is true love? This is the love that we once had. And remember, we said early in Act 1, we learned that Persephone and Hades, their love has flickered and died down. And now they're in more of a business arrangement than a real marriage. And so this next number presents the dichotomy of how Orpheus's plea has affected the two of them. For Persephone, she's on team Orpheus and Eurydice. She wants to see them reunited. She wants to see Eurydice return to the surface. And Hades, he, first of all, he couldn't care less. But second of all, were he to actually relinquish inhabitants of Hadestown and let them go, he's eventually going to be worried that this will compromise his authority and this will weaken him as a ruler. So the next song is called How Long? And this is a good way into Act 2, and we can find this on page 239 in the score. So back to the score we go. And I want to show you something interesting in this score. If we look at it, and we look at Hades' part, we'll see something very curious here. Do you see this little 8 under the bass clef? So the bass clef tells us that Hades is singing in the bass register. What the 8 says is it's telling you, whoever's singing Hades, your job is not to sing the notes as printed, but to sing them 1 octave lower. Or if you like physics, you can think of it as all the notes he's singing, the frequencies he's producing are half of the number that they should be. So instead of singing an A that's 220 hertz, he might be asked to sing an A that's 120 cycles per second. In other words, he has to sing incredibly low. I want to just emphasize that this sign, the 8 under the bass clef, is incredibly rare in vocal music. In fact, outside of this score, I can't think of a single time I have ever seen it. And the reason is because the human voice just can't go that low. So as I said at the beginning of the program, you really need a very special voice to play Hades. It's not something that the average bass or even the average low bass would be able to produce. So here is How Long? This is Persephone pleading with her husband to let Orpheus and Eurydice turn back to the surface. And actually, in many ways, Act 2 so far is really following in parallel with the original story. There isn't really too much that's been changed. Certainly some aspects have been readapted, reworked, but the plot has not been fundamentally altered. Here is the song, and it's called How Long? Just make this a little bit smaller, and there we go. G that Hades sings at the end there, and he sings it one other time and numbered. It's just it's these subterranean frequencies which are perfect for characterizing musically this autocratic tyrant who dwells in a subterranean place. So again, the dichotomy between this opposition between Orpheus and Hades is reflected directly in the writing for the characters and the casting of those singers. That Patrick Page singing the role of Hades here is an extremely low bass, and Orpheus a high tenor. So that's an important element that's missing in, that's not going to be in the operas necessarily, although by convention the character of Orpheus is typically a tenor, but he doesn't sing nearly as high as he does in Hadestown. Speaking of high notes, we've probably been wondering as we make our way to the end of the program, what about that perfect song that Orpheus has been writing all along? Where is it? Has he finished it? The last time we heard a version of it is about halfway through Act 1, and it's right at the critical moment where Eurydice, again suffering, decides to travel to Hadestown to take up work there. So we haven't heard from Orpheus for quite a long time, and yet we learn that in the time between Eurydice's arrival in Hadestown and his own arrival in Hadestown, he's completed the song, and he's going to get a chance to sing it. But there's a wrinkle. Hades, as we see, could not care less about Orpheus, and he couldn't care less about Eurydice, and he's certainly not going to let either of them go now that they're dwelling in his domain. In fact, being such an iron-fisted dictator, he is so disgusted, so contemptuous of Orpheus, even requesting, having the temerity, the gall, the chutzpah to ask not only for safe passage for himself, but also for his beloved Eurydice to leave Hadestown. He has so much contempt for this, he's decided that he's going to, well, execute Orpheus. He's going to kill him. How dare you come here and make requests of me? Don't you know I am the Lord of this town? You don't come here and ask me for things. Now I'm going to kill you. But before I do that, I'll let you sing your song. And so now Orpheus is going to have a chance to sing this perfect song, which he's prophesied early in Act 1 is going to restore the world to balance. This is Epic 3, and it is indeed epic. So what makes it epic? Well, we'll talk about that. Let's go back to the score, and we're going to look here at page 271 where it begins. And you'll recognize some of this. For example, this King of Shadows, King of Shades, referring to Hades, is directly quoted from when we hear it in Act 1. In other words, what Orpheus is going to present to us here is going to start with what he's already sung. In other words, what he sang earlier was a draft, if you will. It was an early version, but now he's fleshed it out, he's completed it. And as it turns out, this perfect song that he's written is all about Hades and this love that he once had with Persephone, which no longer exists. So let's go ahead and listen to it. And what's great here is that as Orpheus is singing it for this very highfalutin audience, namely, he's singing it for Orpheus, is singing for Hermes and Persephone, and of course Hades himself, we get to see the impact that his music has on these supernatural characters who are not sort of mere mortals listening to it, but rather these are gods and goddesses listening to it, and how do they react when they hear what he's been working on all throughout the show. Here is Epic 3 towards the end of Hadestown. What a tremendous number. It's sort of as a composer, it's a tall task when everything is building towards this moment where you present the song. And there's a kind of a mirror image here between the character of Orpheus and the composer herself in this case. that you have to deliver on the promise, right? If you're going to present something that is touted as a song that's going to restore the world to balance, and as we see in the musical, has such a profound effect, even on the cold and black heart of Hades himself, so much so that by the end of the tune, he can't help but sing it himself. And there are a number of reasons why this tune works so well. Some of them are more, inside baseball. They're more bound up with the kind of the structure and the anatomy and the music theory of it. I'll just point out one of those things, which is that this is a great example of what we call modal music, which you remember in the beginning, I talked about how the opening number is really neither in a major key nor a minor key, but it incorporates elements of both because it's really B-flat mixolydian. So it's a mode. And therefore, if we think of major as being happy and minor as being sad, the opening number is major, but it has a little bit of a cloud over it. This one is in a mode which we call the Lydian mode. And it's interesting because these modes all come from the Old Greek. So there is a tie in there to the mythology, but nonetheless, the Lydian mode is this exceptionally bright sound. Astute music theorists would look at this and say, well, there's one flat, so it's F major, but there isn't a single F major chord in the entire thing. So it's definitely not F major. Instead, this is a song that's built around the note B flat, but it's B flat with lots of E naturals over it, which gives it this celestial kind of brightness to it. And you don't need to be a music theorist to hear that. You can appreciate the sound of it and understand that there's something incredibly poignant and moving and expressive about this number. And that's especially true when the pit cuts out and the song goes a cappella. And we get this chanting section, which is simultaneously suffused with the tune, the melody that we've come back to so many times, but also has this polyphonic independence to it. It's a real tour de force of a number, and it works really well. If you're going to have music that's going to convince Hades himself, then this would be it. Now, following the original myth, Hadestown does mirror that ending. Hades allows Orpheus to dare, if he will, to ascend to the surface with Persephone behind him, with Eurydice behind him. But if he looks back, she'll be lost from him forever. And of course, he does look back and she is lost. And so you might ask, well, how does this musical end? We talked about how Monteverdi ended his opera in 1607 with Eurydice being transformed into a star, and Orpheus is told by his father that she awaits him in the firmament. In this version, instead, we get Hermes narrating as he does throughout the show. And what he says is that it is a sad ending, but he says that in the very first song. Remember, it's an old song, it's a sad song. Remember, that's how he describes the story that's going to be told. And what he essentially says, the takeaway, I think, is that it is a sad story, and it's a story that repeats itself over and over again. But by repeating the story and by reliving the story, we're always reminded of the fact that no matter how awful things are, there is no limit to the human imagination for yearning for a better alternative, a better future, a better tomorrow. And also that even when the chips are down and the things are looking rather bleak, you can't underestimate the human spirit in terms of pursuing adventure, and no matter how daunting the obstacles. When it comes to love, there is really nothing that will stand in one's way when one is really fiercely determined as Orpheus is. And that's the moral of the story, and that's the takeaway. So we get this incredible presentation of a myth which goes back to practically to time immemorial, which has been on the stage for hundreds of years. And here, with this allegorical interpretation that takes us into the Victorian era, the Industrial Revolution, maybe it's the Great Depression, and involves issues and ideas, issues which are topical and relevant and germane to society today. Love, which of course will always be relevant, but also the yearning to provide, which is such an important element. I had a friend I was talking to about this, a colleague who joked that, there's something that musicians will no doubt appreciate here, which is that nobody wants to marry them. Of course, he was being tongue-in-cheek, but there is this sense that, can Orpheus provide is a theme that's, an urgent theme that's emphasized at several points within the musical. So, there are people who, by the way, really read into this, and they've interpreted the musical as an attack on capitalism and that the way Hades is described in his business suits and his factories, he's described as a sort of a archetypal capitalist. I don't know that the average audience member would think of that or that it would resonate with them, but it should be mentioned that these kind of interpretations are on the table. And certainly, I think if you read the libretto closely, you could make a strong argument in favor of that argument. So anyway, I hope folks have enjoyed this program. And Pat, I see it's already 8:22, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to you. And I want to thank the library and just let folks know that I will be teaming up with the Darien Library twice in March. So we can give you those dates on the calendar. It's going to be March 9th and March 23rd. And again, March 9th and March 23rd, we've got some fun topics, which we'll tell you all about, and the library will post it on their website. And I'm just so thrilled to be part of the Darien Library family and to be part of the community and to get to share great music with you, even under these unusual circumstances, which are becoming less and less unusual every day. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Gil.
Gil, thank you so much. We do have one quick question.
Of course.
Were you able to see the show on Broadway?
No.
And if so, did it color? But you've already answered, you did not see it.
I told Amy when the theater shut down, my wife, I said, when the theaters reopen, we're going to see Hadestown. That's number one on my list of shows I want to see. So for me, I find, Pat, that as I've conducted and directed more musicals and performed more musical repertoire, I've become more interested in the presentation, the pageantry, the pizzazz, because when you're working in the theater, you realize how much goes into it, all of the blocking and choreography and costumery and set design and carpentry and tapestries and whatever else we're using. Pat, you and I were talking before the program that at NVCC at the college, we're doing a fully staged production of Pippin this semester, which is going to be broadcast at the very end of April, and I'll have information for our community members about how they can watch it if they want to watch that at the end of April, which I hope they all will. And I haven't seen Hadestown, and I'd love to see it, but we are keeping musical theater alive at the college, and I'm just so proud of my students who are, we're coming to campus, we're being very careful and being very following all of our protocols, but to be working in musical theater during these times, one feels very privileged, very blessed.
Terrific. Gil, we will see you on March 9th, and the topic is the rise of the virtuoso.
The rise of the virtuoso in the 19th century. I think people are going to really love this one. We're going to get to watch some really inspiring performances that will leave you gobsmacked. Love that word.
Thank you so much, Gil. We'll look forward to the 9th.
Take care, my friends. Until then.
You bet.